Thanks, Scott. Governor, ladies and gentlemen. RFF is a very nonpartisan organization. It takes no positions on any issue. It works only on projects that are funded by governments or foundations. And everything that we do is on the web and published. I've been with them 2 years, but I've followed them closely for 30. Now, what are the two big things we got to think about today? Since cap and trade and pricing approaches, i.e. taxes, are probably no longer likely, that's one factor we have to take into account. And the other is that there's been a dramatic expansion of potential supplies of domestic natural gas in the form of shale gas, which we've heard about already today. Now, about a year ago, RFF completed a first-of-a-kind study where we looked at 35 energy policies that could be compared systematically against each other using the same methodology to see how much oil consumption they would cause to be reduced and how much CO2 emissions they would lead to be reduced, and what was the effective cost of each of those policies and a cost per ton of reduction. We used the Energy Information Agency's model, NEMS, National Energy Modeling System, which they use for their annual energy outlooks, and we used the base year of 2009. However, because already then we knew there was a lot more potential natural gas than was in that model, we used the potential gas committee's amount, which was about a third to half more than EIA was using. The policies we looked at, some focused on oil, others focused on carbon dioxide, some, like taxes and cap and trade, affected both. Some individual policies were based on general policy thinking and then or other current proposals in the policy discussions in Congress. It turns out that the broadest non-tax proposal, the Clean Energy Standard, is really the most attractive. And because one of our conclusions is that if taxes and cap and trade are not usable, a very broad clean energy portfolio standard which gives credit for natural gas is a cost-effective way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions through 2030 and as long as the reduction target is not over 50%. All economists will tell you, I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer and a lawyer. All economists will say that if society wants to produce various kinds of behavior, the most economically efficient, in other words, the cheapest way to do that is through causing there to be a price, i.e. an added cost, on the behavior to be reduced. Thus, it should be no surprise as we look at some data momentarily that a tax would be the most effective way to reduce oil consumption because all aspects of decisions are reduced and affected. Recycling and how the revenues are recycled is vital. In our analysis, we assume that would all go back to the individuals, but there are analyses that point out there are more economically efficient ways for those revenues to be used. And in fact, there's some current discussion about potentially, if there were such a tax, it be used in deficit reduction. Now, this slide and the next slide describe 5 key policies, the first of which, Renewable Portfolio Standard, does not include natural gas in it, but the others build off of it. And there are 27 states with renewable portfolio standards. They do not give any real favor to natural gas. They give a lot of favor to renewables. The next one, Clean Energy Portfolio Standard, does start to give credit for natural gas where it has benefited from carbon capture and storage. Well, there's very little of that today and not for some time to come. The next 3, SEPS, NG, only natural gas gets a credit in this one as well as renewables, and it has to be new natural gas capacity. And then RINGS combines renewable portfolio standard with a natural gas standard And finally, SEPS-all, which is the one that is the most interesting policy-wise, gives credit for natural gas for existing facilities using it, new facilities using it, as well as renewables, and essentially all non-coal generators. Now, what are the broad conclusions? I don't expect you to read and comprehend all of these individual bars. As a sidelight, the slides are on the website, and what I'm referring to are actually a report which the website on the end of the last slide has got the citation for it, both an executive summary and a 200-page final report into which both of these two graphs you're going to see are located, and there's a lot of discussion about each of the individual policies. Okay, so in terms of reducing oil consumption, the policy that seemed to us to make the most sense was a policy wherein, in effect, we forced much greater use of natural gas in heavy-duty trucks, classes 7 and 8, than is currently planned or even being contemplated. But if you did, and you got 70% of heavy trucks using natural gas by 2030, this would, in effect, have a very substantial reduction in oil consumption, and also it would be done quite inexpensively for reasons that we've already covered. Otherwise, taxes are going to be needed to reduce oil consumption. The clean energy standards have very little impact. They happen to be the numbers way at the far left of the screen far right of the screen as you look at it. Now, as to carbon dioxide reductions, taxes and cap and trade, which are circled, are the cheapest and most effective, while the clean energy standard versions, which have the arrows, are reasonably cheap but don't get as large reductions. Now, because this is a gas audience, I actually put that very same set of policies to show you how much natural gas consumption changes with each of those policies if you're trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And what it shows you is there are really only 4 cases where the natural gas consumption versus the base case. The base case is essentially the modified AEO 2009 with a total TCF of 463 between 2010 and 2030. So what this shows is that the farthest high column on the right as you look at the slide is the natural gas trucks. The next highest, which is just over 10, is SEPS-all, and then rings. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that our cases, because they're based on the EIA methodology, do not take into account the potential implications of the various Clean Air Act-related regulations dealing with SOx, NOx, particulate, and mercury that EPA has in varying stages of development. The number of coal-fired facilities that are be affected by those range in estimates from 6 megawatts to 110 megawatts. If we took, for sake of argument, 58, which is roughly in the middle, that would consume and made some adjustment for the fact that not all of that would be natural gas. There could be an additional 2.2 trillion cubic feet a year of natural gas that goes into the electric utility industry beginning in 2020, some before that, which would be a 22 TCF on this 463 TCF basis. Now, I changed the sort of the policies to show in terms of ranking which are the ones that have the highest natural gas pluses, of which there are really only 3, and then all the rest are not directly beneficial for natural gas. All right. What are the conclusions? Getting to a 2 million barrel a day oil consumption reduction is really tough. There are not many good options other than taxes, except for that heavy truck policy. And finally, the Clean Energy Standard, SEPS-all, is a reasonably cost-effective way of proceeding. We, RFF, announced this work a year ago, and as we always do, we started talking to everybody that would listen, but in particular people in the Congress and their staff and people in the executive branch and the White House. And then in the course of the spring, we have been continued to those discussions. We've answered the questions from the Senate about this. We've had a couple of times talking to people from the White House. There was an open session with EPA last week dealing with that. The 10 days before, we brought together industry people, people from EPA and the White House to try to come up with some ways to more economically, efficiently use a clean energy standard. Now, why is all this interesting to all of us? Shale gas is a game changer, provided it continues to be produced in an environmentally responsible fashion as it has been to date. This enormous resource is going to stabilize prices and reduce the likelihood of dramatic run-ups as occurred 3 years ago, and can help reduce carbon emissions. You can read this quicker than I can read it to you, and the short answer is yes, it can lead to long-run price stability. Here's a chart we made, which is not dissimilar from, I think, one that either David or Scott had, showing the implications of large resources of gas on price, looking out in the future, either with or without a carbon policy. And the core of the answer is that you're in the $6 to $8 range, a little more like $7, a little over $7. Now, the CO2 effective emissions of natural gas are much less than coal. However, and that's because fewer, as you know, fewer BTUs of gas are needed to make electricity than of coal. So therefore, fewer emissions at the combustion side. But at the E&P side for gas, or the mining side for coal, on the E&P side for gas, there are more emissions of methane and some CO2 compared to coal. So that has to be taken into account, particularly because methane has got a higher CO2 equivalent than CO2. But when you do that and you use recent upward estimates of EPA, CO2 equivalent emissions for natural gas are still substantially less than for coal. We've talked a little bit, David talked about transportation. Other than heavy-duty trucks and medium-duty vehicles, where there's some really meaningful activity today, the others may move to gas, but it's not moving as rapidly as many think it could be done. There is, in fact, a separate National Petroleum Council study which specifically is looking at future transportation fuels, including natural gas, electricity, biofuels, and hydrogen. It'll be published probably in the March of next year timeframe. So overall, we've got risk perception issues that threaten natural gas development. These risk perception issues, particularly in the East, arising from Gasland, from the New York Times, public interest groups, are a major challenge for the shale gas development, and thus reasonably responsible, environmentally acceptable development, which is well within the capability of this industry. They've done it for my entire life, and I think I'm older than almost everybody in the room. It can be done. Similarly, there's a movement in electricity regulation issues which seems to generally favor natural gas or renewables. Relative to shale gas, in the spring, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, knowing of the work RFF had done, asked us to give them a proposal on shale gas, which we did. They finally agreed to it in June, and that's going to examine the risks, the preferences, citizens' preferences, and the regulations related to shale gas. We're going to focus in particular on Pennsylvania. We're going to have interim reports over the next 18 months. We'll be finished before EPA has done their study. We will get our results to EPA for them to use. We've been talking to them, and we'll continue to talk to them. So with that, I thank you very, very much. Those are the two of the websites where you could get more information either about the National Energy Policy, which is the bottom site, or RFF itself, and the Center for Energy Economics and Policy, which is the one right above it. Thank you very much.